Hello everyone. Hello Sue.
Hello.
Thanks Louisa, and thanks all of you for being here. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about this project that we have been working on for some time now. And it's always such a delight to see it coming and becoming a reality. So we will certainly be talking about the project. But first of all, maybe I should say a few words about the box, what the box is. I don't know if some of you had the opportunity to come and visit us in Plymouth. The box is a new cultural organization that opened in 2020 under the pandemic. And we house a really substantial collection. It's a very diverse collection ranging from natural history, decorative art, fine art. We even have a designated collection that is actually right now on display in one of our 4 exhibitions that opened last week. We also have huge archives and films archives. And these collections are one of the reasons why we invite artists to spend time with us, to explore our collections, and we invite audiences to really learn from our past and be creative and imaginative about our future. So this is really the reason why an artist like you, Sue, was so important for us and resonated so much for an institution like the Box. So we invited you, first of all, to really come down, visit us, and spend some time in Plymouth, look through, do a little bit of detective work even, and discover if there was anything that not only made sense for you, but that would also make sense for the local context, to create a dialogue, to sparkle, to trigger some kind of interesting dialogues. And that's why we decided also to start with this image. But I think the nicest way to start is really going back to the title of our exhibition, which is Between Memory and Forgetting. And that's why I think a nice bridge between the understanding of what an archive is, what an archive does, and the idea of memory and what gets forgotten create sort of a fruitful starting point for this conversation. So shall we start about how you came up with this title, Between Memory and Forgetting?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who's taken the time to come this evening. I'm very happy to see you all here, and I'm delighted to be here as a guest both of the Photographers Gallery and also to be here because I've been invited for this exhibition at the Box. But to get to this title, Between Memory and Forgetting, it's one of the things that has kind of obsessed me throughout my entire career as an artist. I started as a journalist, and one of my impulses has always been to get news out, to get stories out, to get information out, and to share experiences that I've had and people that I've met, and interesting pieces of information. And of course, coming from South Africa, we have a particularly painful and bitter history that we have to remember, or is it better to forget it? And I just wanted to perhaps start by quoting Regalia Bam, who was in exile out from South Africa for many years. She wasn't able to come back to the country after she'd left because she worked for the World Council of Churches and her passport was withdrawn. But she did come back after the democratic election. And she was before then actually, and she was an extremely important person in drawing up the electoral procedure. But this is what she said when I was making a piece called There's Something I Want to Tell You, which is a 6-screen video presentation of conversations between grandmothers, the veterans of the Mandela generation, and their granddaughters. And the point of making this work which was made in 2013, I think it was to ask all the older women who'd suffered so greatly under apartheid, whether they thought that their sacrifice, the husbands who'd gone overseas and never come back, the daughters who just disappeared, never been found, whether they thought that their sacrifices had been worth it given the somewhat troubled South Africa that we still had in 2013. And at the same time, I wanted to ask their granddaughters whether they actually, well, what they thought of the new South Africa as well, whether it was fulfilling its potential as far as they were concerned, and whether they knew about their grandmother's history. And one of the things that Regalia said was this. She said, I want to give a message to all the young people out there. We should appreciate our history and not forget what happened. You forget because you were not part of it, and because you did not live in that generation. But people sacrificed a lot, and we should all start acting like we appreciate it. And she said, for my generation, sometimes forgetting is escaping the pain. It's not always something we do consciously, but at times, in order to live in the present and enjoy the present, people forget. So there's always a slippage between what we forget and what we remember, and it's good to sometimes remember what we're in the process of forgetting. So that's a bit what my work is about. So when I got this invitation, I don't know if you want to comment at this point or if I should go on talking.
It's fine. I really love that you chose this quote, because it gives both sides of this idea of forgetting, both as a coping mechanism, but also, it gives both the idea of pain and wanting to forget pain, but also the hope of being happy in the present. And I think we will be coming back to that idea of happiness and sadness through the work and through the lived experiences of all these women that you talk about. Yes, maybe why don't we?
Let's start. Yes.
Yeah.
So when Nicoletta invited me to come down to Plymouth, and this was in June of last year, to come and have a look at the collection, I was going to go for 24 hours, and I knew that this collection had 40,000 objects. And the idea of sort of going through 40,000 objects in 24 hours and finding something to work from that related to my own practice was a little overwhelming. But I was very happy to find that the Plymouth box, the box does have at least a large part of their collection online, so you can check in, you can go to their archives and go through them. And one of the things that I found was this photograph, which I liked very much as a photograph, but it also happens to be a photo of the Anglo-Boer War Memorial in Plymouth. And of course the Anglo-Boer War Memorial was something which was, I've worked around the Anglo-Boer War in the past, and it was very much in my mind that this could well be the object or the starting point for a new work. So I went down to Plymouth. I was accompanied by Jessie Cohen from the Goodman Gallery, and on the first morning that we were there, we got up early and went and had a look. And here it is, now looking much greener, surrounded by plants.
Good weather, though.
Good weather, yes. And if you get up close to it and you look at the side, you'll see that this side says, "Towards another world." And there's an image that's been cast in. It's Prince Christian, who is Queen Victoria's grandson, and he's being carried up to heaven by angels. It says there, yes, in memory of Christian Victor, Prince of Schleswig-Holstein. And it also, on the other side, we have photographs of a battle, soldiers fighting, and it lists all the different battles, the names of the battles where these battles took place. And it reminded me exactly of, and on the left you see that obelisk on the Plymouth Hoe was erected in 1913, and it was launched by the city. You see the very beautiful invitation card on the left, which is part of the box collection, and it's actually on display at the box now as part of the exhibition. But it reminded me in its form exactly of another memorial, which is the one you see on the right, and that's the Women's Memorial in Bloemfontein, which remembers to the memory of our dear children and our mothers. There were 23,670 women and children who died of starvation or malnutrition in the concentration camps set up by the British during the Anglo-Boer War. So it made me think that here was the same form of monument, and yet it was the same story. It was memorializing for different groups of people the same events, the Anglo-Boer War, but they told very different stories. And each one was a legitimate story. We want to honor those who died in our service. But of course, it's two sides. It's two sides of the same coin.
Well, they are narrating exactly from the two points of view, and I think what was fascinating was also the fact that there was an obelisk, which is often actually used as a sort of memorial.
Yes, it's a very classic.
It's a classic
form of
thing.
Memorialization.
So, in fact, in both, as you can see, the center of in both of the obelisks, the images are different, and of course, as we know, as Sue just explained, they're dedicated to very different things. But I think that image was so powerful that really sort of started some kind of conversation in Plymouth already.
Yes.
Because it was very important for us to make sure that how can we make this moment actually open up for discussion for better futures, really, and the fact that the one in Plymouth has, I'm going back, towards another world was also, I guess, important for you,
well, that
for
was
us.
another thing. This phrase, towards another world, seems to promise something better. It's always a just war. Whoever has started the war is arguing that they're trying to improve something. We have it, Putin is still saying it's a just war in Ukraine. He's doing it to benefit his country. So it's always about somebody who's supposedly being benefited, which is so ironic. And this is a book which I bought in the Boer War Museum in the late 80s, and it was in their gift shop. And it's called My Anglo-Boer War Story Colouring In Book. And it's obviously something that's been commissioned by the museum. And somebody's been handed these archival photographs and somebody else has traced over them, not terribly well. In fact, very badly in some cases, although in some ways I think that's part of its charm. But it tells the story, and it's as if it's a parent explaining the Anglo-Boer War to a child. So this final page says, and it's the end. You can see again it's the monument. And it's talking about how the Boers picked themselves up after the war and started again and began to farm and recover their lives. So it said they were very happy, but they would never forget how heart-sore the war had made them. The Women's Monument would always remind them of the mothers and the children who died in the concentration camps. So that's the last page in the book. And from that book in 1992, I made a piece called Colouring In Book, because it occurred to me that the things that we're still at a time when 1992 was, well, I mean, we hadn't yet had the first democratic election, but it was supposedly the end of apartheid. But I'd been through a long battle, being a member of organizations trying to save the demolition of Crossroads. And it occurred to me that the things that were happening to the people in Crossroads, which was a squatter camp just outside, well, next to the Cape Town airport, where mainly housed women and families from the rural areas who'd come to live with their husbands who were contract laborers in Cape Town. And the kind of treatment that the apartheid government was handing out was exactly the same kind of thing that the British soldiers had meted out to the Boers. People's homes were destroyed, they were arrested, they were chased, they were constantly harassed. You can see in that top right picture, policemen looking over the camps. People were under constant surveillance. And so it seemed like a circular story. You know, the Boers had finished the Boer War in a completely decimated and impoverished state. And I think that in a sense that was possibly, we could say that that was the beginning of one of the seeds of apartheid. And so I told this story through the pages of the colouring book. I found contemporary images from the archives, which, can we just go back a moment? Sure. Which showed actual photographs taken from the concentration camp times, a child being buried, and made this parallel story. The other photographs, and this one here, these are all framed in a way that people in Crossroads framed their photographs, little photographs, and it says this particular quote in Xhosa, but they're all from the Bible, and this is the revival at the end. People's little businesses are starting up again, little restaurants, and it says the hand of God is not too short to reach us. And so it's a circular process. So of course the image that you saw was of the monument was the last page in the book, and by that time I had it in my mind that might be a very interesting thing to do. So then we're going to look at the outside of...
Oh, yes.
Yes, the outside of
we can move on.
St. Luke's.
But also what I wanted to say is that it occurred to me today, actually, while looking at these images again, and never thought about it before, but like the very idea of coloring in is like filling these gaps, filling these voids, and how, like, you know, through this booklet, you know, for children, there was a sort of an educational moment. But, you know, going back to what we were saying before about memory and what are you covering or occupying some voids with as a, you know, clear decision from this point of view, and then moving forward, how you just expose the two images and the two stories. So how the abused child became an abusive parent. I thought, you know, it occurred to me for the first time that the idea of covering something and coloring in brings that to the fore as well.
Yes, it is about filling in the gaps in many ways. And this is the actual building which is immediately opposite the main museum, the box. It's a few steps away, and it's a very beautiful old church with lovely spaces inside. And I just wanted to show you the exterior. And at one end, there's this very beautiful contemporary glass window, which was commissioned by the box as one of their first commissions. And there I am looking up at it and thinking what a beautiful space it was. And
so here we go.
And so here we go. Here is the obelisk, the new obelisk that I've erected, which tells the story of the stories that we've been talking about.
The work is titled Towards Another World.
It's called Towards Another World. It's a steel structure which you can't quite see clearly, but it's just like the framework. It's as if a monument's been stripped away. It's down to its bones, and it's not anchored on the ground. It's suspended. It's suspended above a pile of blackened branches and blackened bricks, which represent the detritus that war leaves behind. And on it we have these various portraits, and they're not sculpted or cast in a kind of traditional memorial way. They're simply embroidered very thinly on cotton voile, very thin fabric. I brought them all just in one roll, and they've just been placed on that steel structure. They're held there with little magnets. So they're almost as if they've just attached themselves there. And they tell the story of all the people who were involved in the war. So at the bottom right, we have I don't know if we could show the video at this stage.
Shall we show the video now? Yes.
There's a little video which goes around it.
Let's see if technology is with us.
If technology is with us.
So there is no sound, but very kindly, Al managed to put together a brief clip that he took last week, so you can get a better sense of not only of the space and of the installation, but also of the details. Because as you can imagine, I think you know, the fact that it is really a deconstructed monument, it really plays a lot with this idea of transparency and what you see and what you cannot see. So it's quite difficult as well to really grasp the various layers of this work. And I think this video does it quite well. And I really loved the idea you had originally, Sue, about suspending it. Because again, monuments are very much solid on the ground. And the second that you suspend something, it doesn't have roots anymore. And it can shift and move. And on the floor you've positioned, as you just mentioned, those burnt branches, which could look like dead roots, that I also love as a kind of hint to what you were trying to do with this sculpture.
And these are pages from the colouring in book again. You can see the farmer on the back here with his family before the war, and then the British soldiers coming and so on. And it's almost as if the pages have detached themselves from the other work and just blown across and stuck on this obelisk. And this is Emily Hobhouse. I think some of you may be familiar with Emily Hobhouse, but she was a British woman. She came from St Ives in Cornwall, and she had a very curious nature. She travelled quite a lot. She went to Mexico, and then she came back again, and she heard about the war, the Anglo-Boer War, and she decided that she wanted to see for herself. And she took a ship and came to Cape Town and argued with the military and managed to visit the concentration camps, which were tents, basically, with very limited means and very limited medical facilities. And she was absolutely horrified by what she saw. And she started writing for the British press, and she raised the question of what was going on in South Africa, in England, and had a very powerful role in changing public opinion about the war.
Yeah, well, she thought she would find one concentration camp. She found 45. And when she came back, she founded the Distress Fund for South Africa, and she supported that massively on the distribution to support women and children. This is certainly, for me personally, one of the biggest discoveries that happened through this process, and it really, enriched me massively. I always try, if possible, to read this quote by her, because I find it's so meaningful and relevant for everybody. I came quite naturally in obedience to the feeling of unity or oneness with womanhood. It is when the community is shaken to its foundation that a deeper unity of humanity evinces itself.
But she's considered one of the heroines of the Boer War, and in fact she was invited to open the memorial when it was consecrated or launched, or whatever the word is for memorial, in 1913, and she was on the train from Cape Town and she got sick, but so she was sent back on medical advice, and so she didn't actually open it, but her speech was read. And in fact, when she died, her ashes are consecrated at the War Memorial in Bloemfontein, so she's very much a heroine. And I believe that they're now in the process of constructing a museum for her at St Ives. The rectory where she was brought up is being turned into a museum to honour her. And
we then decided, to use some of the images that also look into the archives. And I think what we managed to do was to present part of our archives, so what you've researched and selected, but also what you brought to us. So it is really a mixture of our public archives and your private archive. So we decided to show this because you brought it from
Yes, I brought
Cape.
this.
Yeah.
Because I found out about them, and it seemed to me particularly ironic. As you see, it's a little tin. It's a tin that once contained chocolates, and Queen Victoria decided in 1900 that it would be an appropriate Christmas present for every soldier in South Africa. So it's written on the front. Well, you can see South Africa 1900, and at the bottom it says, "I wish you a happy new year, Victoria." And the chocolate makers in England were instructed to make these chocolates for the tins. And apparently, I think it was the Rowntree and Cadbury families were Quakers and were pacifists and didn't really approve of the war in any case, but under royal orders, these chocolates were made and sent out. And you can actually find these tins quite easily on the internet. There still seem to be quite a lot of them around. But it seemed to me to be a particular irony that there you are facing in battle, and you get a little tin of chocolates wishing you a happy new year. Anyway. This
is another work that we decided to show. So I think what we are really proud is that not only we are exhibiting historical pieces like this one, but we've also managed to produce a new work that we've just discovered. But I think we decided to show this work, Monument 1 and 2, as they're called, alongside Colouring In and the new commission, because together they really talk about how you say your own obsession with memorials and how that kind of played since the very beginning of your work. So do you want to tell us a little bit about this diptych?
Yes, these are 2 screen prints. They're about the first screen prints I ever made, and I made them in 1980. And it's part of a series of works called Monument Park, in which I visualized South Africa as this country dominated by these ridiculous nationalistic statues which would travel around the country on clouds and come to disaster in various ways. And here we have President Kruger, who was one of the great Boer leaders, in picture 1, floating past the Voortrekker Monument, which is the, yes, I mean, it's the major memorial to Afrikanerdom in the country, and little hearts are floating up there, admiring each other's presence. And in the next one, the revolution has come, and in 1980 we did think it was going to end in revolution, and a lightning has struck the Voortrekker Monument, and President Kruger is being toppled from his perch. He's falling backwards. So those 2 are from 1980, and we just include them because of this sort of interest in monuments and what monuments may or may not mean.
And speaking of monuments, I think this is another new work, and it's a work in progress that originally you started the first version in 2014, I believe, and I love that you proposed to make a new version here, because in a way I see it also as a way of memorializing individuals. So this is a community-led work in which Sue has invited women in Plymouth to write a note or a memory about a woman that was important in their life. And actually, I didn't tell you this, but today I was told that all the boards that we've added, they've been used. So it is very, so people are using it. It is a live monument of people that want to remember specific individuals, and particularly women that want to remember other women, which, yeah, so shall we show some details, because I think some of them are really nice.
But it's also about this idea that everybody has a voice and everybody's stories are important. You don't have to be a writer, you don't have to be an artist, you don't have to be published to make your story important. And that the ordinary stories of people's everyday stories are also important and can be put on display for everybody to read. And as you see, this wasn't posed. Somebody came in while the photographer was taking posters, and there's that little stack of boards at the lower left, and you can take it off, and there's some pens there, and you can write something and add it on. And as Nicoletta said, the museum is simply going to add more boards as these get filled up. So I can imagine by June, I think you'll have to get a crate to store them. But it'll be a living history of people at a certain moment in time and how they felt about the women in their lives. Some are funny.
Some are very funny.
Some are profound, some are sad. So, yes.
Yeah, and I think, what we loved is also to start this work before the exhibition started, so to involve communities beforehand, and, for this work to be continued in such way. So talking about more historical works and how through your entire career you have always tried to give platform to women and to provide a space for these women, for these stories to be told. This work is actually where the exhibition starts, or as we think we wanted the exhibition to start. This work is titled A Few South Africans.
Yes.
And we decided to show it really to tell the story of Sue and how it all began, and also how with this work is really a clear example of for you, art is not just inside the gallery space, but how it really can bridge and go outside of the gallery space. So do you want to tell us a little bit how it all started and also how he escaped the gallery space?
Yes, well, it's called A Few South Africans, by the way, because there were so many. It's not meant to be a definitive list of the most active, the most well-known women who were involved in the liberation struggle. It was simply those who I met or could reach out to, and so on. But it sort of started because, well, one thing was I'd just gone back to art school to do an advanced diploma in printmaking, so I was thinking of making a body of work. And I had made some previous works. I also was working a few days a week in Crossroads, which was this squatter camp, and for that I would take out small postcard-sized etching plates, and I would draw or dry point on the spot, and then I'd have whoever it was write a story, a little thing in my sketchbook, and I would work those into smaller pieces. So I'd made several of these, but going back to art school, my tutor said to me, well, these are fine, but you have to work larger and bolder. So I started making these new works, and I decided that since I was spending so much time in Crossroads anyway, it would be interesting to look at what people had on their walls and who was important. I mean, it was a whole community that one just didn't know who they knew about and who they didn't know about. And, well, this is a later one, actually, that I made a bit later, but I will talk about this one. It's Victorian Goma. This was a work that was made in 1984, which was the year after I started the series. And Virginia Ngoma lived in Alexandra, which is next to Sandton. It's about half an hour from the centre of Johannesburg. And the state-owned bus company put up the bus fares. This was in the 1950s. And people felt it was very unfair because a few pennies to them was a great deal. And Virginia was one of those who organised a bus boycott, and it was total. Nobody caught the buses for 3 months. So you see on the left-hand side, somebody's on the back of a bicycle. People rode to work on bicycles, or they walked. And coming back at the night, it was this daily routine of this long, long walk into town and out of town, just so they didn't have to catch the buses. And it was successful. The buses didn't run, at least they gave in. They lowered the bus fares back to the previous limit. This is Amina Kachalia. The way that I worked with most of these is, you see a photo on the left, I'd do a photo shoot and then I'd select one of them to be the photo for this particular work. And I'd take the background out as you saw with the previous one. So that's Amina, and on the left you see Amina, her husband Yusuf, and her sister Zainab in a photograph. She wasn't even allowed, although her sister lived next door, she wasn't even allowed to communicate with her because they were both under banning orders. I mean, that's the ridiculousness of apartheid. Those are her children, Coco and Khaleb. She wasn't allowed to go to their school or have anything to do with the school. And so around these frames, I added in these little extra details to give you another layer to their stories. And this is Annie Selinga. This was one of the first ones I did. I knew Annie because we were in one of the same women's organizations. And Annie was famous not only because she'd been a key member of the Defiance campaign in the 50s, but also because she'd been one of the 20,000 women who walked to Pretoria. And she had announced in a public meeting outside the Cape Town City Hall, that little detail on the left, that she would never carry a pass until the day that the white Prime Minister's wife carried a pass. And for this, she was arrested, and she was sent away on a train to the rural areas. But she escaped, and she came back, and this happened a few times, but she refused on principle her whole life to carry a pass. And then when Annie died, which was about 2 years after I took that photograph, I made T-shirts for the funeral and other little shirts because T-shirts were a very important thing in South Africa. Political funerals, there were always T-shirts with portraits. It was a part of, because people were not allowed to meet under the Illegal Gatherings Act, funerals were a meeting point.
You also produced postcards
of
yes. A few South Africans, so of each of the women depicted that we saw, after a while, they became postcards that were distributed everywhere, and they still are.
Well, they still are. I saw a photograph of the Mandela House Museum in Soweto a couple of weeks ago, and I see they're on the wall up there as well.
And
so they're still around.
What I love is that on the back you will have like a paragraph or two describing the story of these incredible women. And what I love is this idea of cultural generosity that it's clearly shown throughout your work, which leads us to All Our Mothers, which is another work that is currently on display at the box, and that on the last day before coming back, on Saturday actually, before coming back to London, I walked in front and I felt all the gazes of these incredible women there. And you know, even if it's a huge space, St. Luke's, where the exhibition is, and we wanted to leave the centre quite free and open for people to really encounter these women. And I feel that with the community-led work and all these other portraits that you have, there is really this sense of the space is busy, full of people and of individuals with great history for everybody to go and enjoy and discover, really. But yeah, so going back to All Our Mothers, I think it would be interesting also to talk about specifically on this work, how you divided the black and white part, and historically how it is truly a generational piece, in a sense that you've depicted as well the same woman maybe 30 years after. There are some daughters there too. And I'm very proud there are 2 new works. So it is still an in progress somehow.
Well, it is. There's still a few people that I need to photograph. The first ones are in black and white, and that was because I wasn't really taking them as photographic portraits, but as source material for the few South African series, or just because I was meeting them. And it was only in about 2011, when I was sort of thinking about the work I'd made over the years and what I would do next, that I decided it was time to revisit the women. And I spoke to Amina particularly, who had been particularly helpful and close working with on this series. And I decided to come up to Johannesburg and re-photograph Amina and Caroline Motsoaledi. So then I decided that since the early ones had been in black and white, and I was no longer on film, because I was no longer using that camera, I'd moved on to digital, as so many of us did, that I would now photograph in colour. But that's also about the changing of the politics. You know, it's about moving from a black and white, a grim world, to one that was more optimistic and colourful. So, I mean, that was a part of it as well. And this is Barbara Mazzuchello. This photograph was taken in August last year, and this is one of the new ones. And Barbara, and that's Frene Ginwala. Frene very, very sadly died at the end of last year. Her memorial service was actually this week. She was one of the extremely intellectual members of Parliament. She was one of the key women who helped to draft the Constitution and who formally handed it over to Nelson Mandela. And she's holding the Constitution in her hand, which fortuitously matched her sari. But that was a lucky coincidence. But I would like to salute Frene because she was a most remarkable person. One of the things that she did which particularly charmed me was when she was made Speaker of the House of Parliament, she was invited to make a documentary to tell the people, to explain to the public how Parliament worked. And she decided it would just be too boring if it was her talking. So she invited Peter Dirk Ace and his drag queen character of Evita Besadenhout to come to Parliament, and he drove up and he's filmed getting out, and they have this wonderful conversation as he kind of questions all the different aspects of Parliament in a very humorous way. And I'm sure that people had a much better understanding of Parliament after that. And I thought it was lovely because, I mean, one cannot possibly imagine the apartheid government doing anything like that.
So I think...
And then just very briefly, I'm just going to show a couple of other works.
Yes.
These are up at the Goodman at the moment. It's a series called Truth Games. And it's also, this was a series of works that was made in 1998, immediately after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission finished its deliberations. Well, finished it. They didn't ever finish, really, but concluded their processes. And in each case, you have a victim on one side, the perpetrator on the other, and there's this kind of dialogue. All of these images are taken directly from newspapers, and the text is also taken directly. I just literally copied on a photocopier the text, trying to explain on both what each side has said. So we had attacked a church. What happened was, this was the St. James Church incident in which 4 young black men, or 5 young black men from one of the black organizations burst into a church and opened fire. 11 people died. And Liesl Ackerman on the left, her mother was killed. And so we have the story, attacked a church. He is saying that he helped the struggle, and she says there's no justification. And then he says, I'm sorry about your mom. And she said, I wanted to hear that. And he's explaining, I obey orders. So there's this kind of dialogue which at least reach some kind of understanding. And this is another one. This is Abu Bakr Ismail on the right, Neville Clarence on the left, a white man who lost his sight when a car bomb set by Abu Bakr Ismail, who was part of Mkonte Sizwe, blew up a car. And we have the same, he's saying he took up arms to defeat apartheid, and he takes full responsibility. And Neville Clarence shook hands with him, and there's sorrows expressed. So there was, in some cases, a few cases, there was a form of reconciliation. But the form of this is that you can move these slats around. You can, because in this particular format where you see the slats where they are, you can't really see the car in the middle. So that if you want to really engage with the piece, the idea is you have to move them aside, see who said what, look at the evidence, and decide for yourself whether you think either side is telling the truth, whether a reconciliation has been reached or not, and whether there's any justification for the actions.
I think now it's quite clear, we've gone through some of the works, most of which were in the exhibition, and we will show you a few more. But I think what is clear is also, and I want to highlight that, how freely you move between media. And, we started with a new commission that is an installation, and then we went to etchings, photographs, and films are such an important part of your work. And so I think it would be really nice if we can spend a few last moments talking about your film practice and how important they have been, and in constant dialogue with everything else that you were doing as well. And just as a reminder, I'm very pleased because on the 31st of March we will also be showing some of Sue's films in Plymouth at the Plymouth Arts Cinema, so that could be a very good opportunity for you to come. But so this film is what is this thing called Freedom. I love the title. And it's from 2016. And it's part of this grouping that you've titled No More Fairy Tales, that I love. And they all speak about forgiveness, loneliness, respect. But at the same time, there is this constant sense of intergenerational or generational cycle where children talks to their mothers, mothers talk to, grandmothers talk to their nieces, and there is a very powerful thing going on when, for the first time, specific questions are asked about what the grandmothers did, what they've experienced, and what is that the so-called born free have or know about their grandmothers and that story.
Yes. As Nicoletta said, this particular one is called What is This Thing Called Freedom, which Nicoletta is, which Buklebezwe Siwani, who some of you might know her work, it was at the Tate recently, she's a young artist, but at this point she was still at university, and that's what she's asking, what is this thing called freedom? We haven't The university syllabuses haven't changed. We still have to pay exorbitant fees. White privilege is still white privilege, and the rest of us are having a very hard time. So that's Bukle Bezwe, and her grandmother Joyce is in the red wrap, and her mother Bully, and they're talking about their different experiences of apartheid. This was a point at which the optimism of early years has faded away, and young people were starting to question exactly what was going on. So this was a film called, this is the first one in the series. It's called It's a Pleasure to Meet You, where two young people whose fathers were killed by the apartheid police meet for the first time and discuss the experiences of growing up without a father and how they feel about it. And this is a second one with the same young man. His name is Sia Ndawela Mgaduka, and in this second one he's now talking to his mother, a conversation he hadn't spoken to his mother about his father. By this time, for nearly 20 years, his father had been killed, but he'd never been able to speak to his mother about the experience, and she has agreed to take part in this conversation. And he talks in a very intimate and open way about what it was like to live in a house where his mother went to bed every night in the largest room of the house, but she was alone and he never knew what she was thinking. So, yeah, these films will be shown also on the Barnes exhibition in Philadelphia from the beginning of March.
Well, it opens on the 5th of March.
Opens on the 5th of March.
So very soon. And the title of the show I also love, Tell Me What You Remember.
Yes, and that's called Tell Me What You Remember, and it's a joint show with Lebachan Khanye, who's a young photographer, and Emma Lewis is the curator. And yes, if anybody is in the States, that would be very nice if you came. And finally, this is just an old work of mine, which was made originally for the Second Johannesburg Biennale. It's called Messages from the Motor, and it's a recovery of the names of the slave trade that brought people from all parts of the East Indies to the Cape in the 16 and 1700s to work as enslaved persons for the Dutch East India Company. And it's now hanging in the courtyard of the National Gallery. They've had it in their possession for 12 years, but they haven't shown it before. And there's water that drips through it the entire time.
So, to conclude, I am very grateful that Yusuf have been so generous in bringing your life's work to Plymouth. And it is your first institutional exhibition in this country, although you were born in this country. And I really do hope that, the sort of initial sense of excitement that we already felt on Friday and Saturday from people will continue until June. And I really do invite each of you to come down and tell your friends to come down, because it is quite a special project. And thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks, Louisa, and everybody at the Photographers Gallery. But most of all, thank you, Sue.